three distinguished scholars. The origin of this conversation is because both Professors Kenneth Harrow and Richard Joseph received the Distinguished Africanist Award for 2023. As someone who received this same award some years back, I understand the meaning, I appreciate its significance, the symbolism, and the joy, not to mention the reward for decades and decades of hard work in a very competitive setting. So let me start by congratulating them and others later on in the program. You can join them. For those of you who have been attending this series, let me repeat the technical issues. We use this device in a technology made possible called streaming, to stream to other networks, and we have partners in 21 countries. And second, in view of the rising data fee in African countries, many people are joining by cheaper outlets, Telegram and Facebook and others. The minimum we get per interview is now approaching over 2 million audience. We can never know the number as in the live television. Sometimes they tell us, as in that of Mbeki, 35 million people. So it has become very popular, and they now join us in former socialist countries. We have partners in Yugoslavia, in China, they've joined us there, and in other places. And 5 minutes after this interview, we release to the world the entire transcript. We just release them automatically unedited. We don't edit them. So members of the audience, you can't tell us after the interview that you want to change your mind. You can't change your mind. Whatever you say, I could see Ni Oshundari here once inciting a Yoruba proverb. The word is an egg. Once you utter it, the egg is broken. So we don't edit, you can't ask us to remove what you have said. We don't do that. So the way we are going to proceed, members of the panel, after they finish their conversation, members of the audience will take over. I'm glad that the three participants have joined us. Professor Richard Joseph is very well known. I've known him since the 1980s. Came to Nigeria, he lived among us. He participated in my conference in 1988 on Obafemi Awolowo. And he's very well known throughout his career for great books on Cameroon, on Nigeria, what we now call international history and politics. He worked at the Carter Foundation, where he made his major impact, was once a director at Northwestern. Kenneth Harrow I've known for a long time. He followed me to Nigeria to visit many universities, and part of the legacies was a recommendation we made in one university to establish a department of economics and philosophy, which they've adopted, and they've graduated their first set of students. I've known Professor Alidou for some time. We've interacted. I'm a member of the Mazuri village and clan. We all belong to that Mazuri tradition, and I remain very grateful for the collaboration. And she served as the president of the African Studies Association. And it was also a privilege for me to have also served in that same capacity. And we are now both past presidents. And I will talk about that as this information unfolds. Let me call on Professor Ken Harrow to start this conversation going. I give you between 7 and 10 minutes to talk about your career, what you think are your major contributions. In your age, people get afraid. What are your fears? I remember the last set of memos that Jan Van Sina was writing before he died. He was very angry, hurting, and things like that. So I understand why, as people get older, they can be angry. Or they can be having some fears about the future of the discipline, everything you're willing to talk about between 7 and 10 minutes. Thank you, Professor Harrow. Unmute, please. Unmute.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank
you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the privilege of starting off this conversation, for being here, for your kind words, for your introduction, and for being there. You added a large charge. What I took on to begin this, I think of African studies as way too vast a field for me to be able to pontificate with a straight face. So I have to focus on a narrower scope in order to pretend that I can speak with any authority. You ended your introduction by asking us to talk about how we see the future, and maybe that could come out in later conversation. I put together a statement that should take me about 7-8 minutes. But what I focused on was, for me, the beginning. That is to say, how I came into the field, and let me make it clear, my field in the beginning was African literature. It's a field I feel I know something about. I was part of the burgeoning growth of that field. And so I'm really taking inspiration from Richard Joseph's suggestion. How do we come into the field? In addressing that question for myself, I'm trying to elucidate for the audience a little bit what the field was like back in the day. What day was it? So let me say that when I came into the field in the 1970s, it was by chance, by a lucky chance. I had, for my first sabbatical, I put out a proposal to study Camus along with North African literature. I had not studied African literature in my graduate years in NYU in the 1960s, and such a field really didn't exist for that study. But in winning a small NEH grant, I was able to study Maghrebian literature. I dropped Camus, and I never looked back. That is, I never looked back to the choice to look at North African literature from that point. My first book project, which I'll tell you about, not because of the book, but because of what it tells you of the field, dealt with Islam and African literature. And I wanted to learn about Islam because the African literature I was reading, this was after, I would say after the 1970s, late 1970s, consisted of such works as Sheikh Amadou Khan's L'Aventure Ambiguë, Birgo Diop's Tales of Amadou Koumba, Hamid Baal's work on Tierno Bokar and Kaidara, Tamerlai's Le Regard du Roi, Tayyib Saleh's The Wedding of Zion, and many other. Those books were marked by Muslim Sufism, by mysticism, which no one had written about up until that point. So in reading them, I began to research Islam in African literature, or even just Islam, practices of Islam in Africa. Now we're talking about the very early 1980s. I can assure you there was nothing in the literary world on that topic, and very little, even on Islam itself, believe it or not, in that period. So I turned to people who studied Islam as historians, and that included people I knew, like Dave Robinson or Jay Spalding or Litwin Captains, the people Litwin had read Arabic literature and knew about East African history. And using such figures, I put together my first volume, which was called Faces of Islam in African literature. That came out with Heinemann, 1991. And it led me, there was too much of a topic to cover in one book, to a second book called The Marabou and the Muse. The title actually came from a suggestion from Ali Mazrui, followed. So that was one beginning. How about the critical approaches? In that period, the 1980s, that was the high point for post-structuralism and deconstruction. And I was trying to keep up. I used some of that deconstructive theory in my first book on African Lit, which was called Thresholds of Change in African Literature. It came out with Heinemann, if you remember. That used to be all our publications in those days. Heinemann's no more. And I used Derridian deconstruction. I also took on the question of feminism. And by that point, at one point in those years, later in the 80s, I was elected president of the African Literature Association. That was my real home in those years. And I gave the presidential talk, mentioned all the authors that I esteemed. And someone in the audience said, yeah, but you haven't talked about women authors. Why not? I was really embarrassed. And they were right. I needed to pay attention to women authors. So I began to focus upon questions of feminism. And I asked the writing theoretical approaches to feminism in those years were influenced by French feminists, people like Sixou and Irigaray and so on. So I used those theorists along with the post-colonial theorists, Spivak and Baba, in order to analyze the works of African women authors like Dangaremba and Alidou and Tadjou and Bayala and so on. And I was asking myself and us the question, okay, if these are the theories that literary critics are using in feminist studies nowadays, do they make sense to use them in relationship to African women authors? And following that, my work, which finally came out, dealing with feminism, African women scholars began to study what was called womanism, and female figures, particularly in Nigeria, became common. So that was, again, our field was beginning with those studies at that point. We asked ourselves in the 70s and 80s, what kinds of approach should we take to African literature? And I have to tell you, the dominant sociological and anthropological approaches based upon ethnography put me off. We were not really studying the literature when we said, this is what Igbo people are like, and so how do we see how true is Things Fall Apart to the realities of Igbo? That wasn't studying Things Fall Apart as the novel, that was studying it as some kind of anthropological or ethnographic evidence, and I really hated that approach. And so I turned to the literary criticisms of our period, which were dominant by the 1990s, which included structuralism, and I was looking for works by African authors that would accommodate such literary approaches, that were not straight up social or historical realism. Works that went beyond the straight realism included early Bayala, Sani Labutansi, who, as you remember, worked with magical realism, the Sufi tales of Birago Diop, the poetry and the drama of Shoyenka and Okibo. These were people who went beyond straight realism, and I wanted to use post-structuralist or deconstructionist criticism in reading their work. I felt our field needed to be more than an offshoot of sociology or anthropology, which fixed African people as fixed items, exotic items for the audience. I hated that. So I wanted the respect for the complexity of the literature, and that demanded it, for me, it demanded reading it as more than simply responses to Western colonialism or to Western history. I didn't want to think of African history as beginning when the Europeans first came. Africa had its own culture, its own literary world. And for me, literary criticism in Africa should begin at the point where African authors' points of reference would be taken to be other African authors, not European authors. I didn't need to read Graham Greene and Joyce Carey in order to understand Things Fall Apart. I needed to understand the world of Igbo expression, of Igbo literature. Even oral literature was important. In that regard, I was deviating from the suggestion, deviating strongly from the suggestion of Edward Said, who had said that when we, in the study of African literature, should begin with Joseph Conrad. What he really was saying was, how do authors like Achebe respond to Conrad? But I wasn't interested in the response and the reaction to European authors. I was interested in the creation of something new and critical and important, a body of works that we could call African literature, but which would become a body of its own at the point at which other African authors would use that as the point of reference. I thought that was a crucial point, demarcation for how we should be then reading African lit. And so I put together a conference at MSU, including the leading lights of post-colonial studies for the day, and they included Edward Said and Spivak, but also Gates, Appiah, and African critics such as Eustace Palmer and Midiowan. These were, I would call, the precursors to Mudimbe and to Mbembe. And I want to make clear from this point on in my thinking, increasingly I came to be swayed by the arguments of Simon Gikandi, who would say, if you want to understand Europe, not Africa, but Europe, look to Africa, look to the way Africans interacted with Europe, and look at the way Europe came to define itself in relationship to Africa. I'm not looking at the way Africa came to define itself in relationship to Europe. You understand? That was a kind of key turning point for me, where Gikandi really made powerful arguments. And those arguments led us to, I would say, closer to the point where I think we are today. We're now dealing with a generation after the founders. To tell you the truth, it's two generations. Achebe's early work is the work of the grandfather. Adichie, when she quotes him and is trying to imitate his style, she's not doing it as a daughter. She's doing it as a granddaughter. And to understand the work, now my field has become increasingly African cinema. To understand the work of authors like Adichie or filmmakers, to understand the great novelists like Teju Cole, we're understanding people whose lives are intertwined with the thinking of scholars who have been influenced by European as well as by African writers. I'm thinking first of Mudimbe, who is the previous generation, and Mbembe, who is certainly one of the leading lights of our day. And it's important to understand this correlation between the European and the African world. For me, that's where African studies, the field of African studies in my area, which is cinema and literature, necessarily requires understanding people who have felt the influences across the continents, and not simply Afropolitanism, which looks like a kind of elitist way, but in the most broad sense of understanding the cultures as not being impervious to each other, but as being heavily marked by the intersection of those. So later I could talk about my fears in the future and the view of the old man, because I turned 80. So I'll happily accept the mantle of age. But for now, let me simply say, we began in those years looking with joy at Ni Oshundari and thinking about his poetry and how that marked all of us. And when I think of Ni giving his poetry, I'm thinking not only of Nigeria, I'm thinking of New Orleans, I'm thinking of the worlds that we shared for so many years in the African Literature Association when he would read his poems. And for us, that was a crossing of worlds. It's really where Africa is today. Can I finish with one last point?
Go ahead, please.
This is yeah, 1 second. Last idea. I made this argument at some point, and Tejo Olaniyan, when I said, when we draw the map of Africa, we have to include these larger spaces. And Teju said, no, it's the continent itself where we have to draw the line. And so I don't know the answer. I'll leave that for you all to think about. If you say, where is Africa today? It's, of course, it's still, as we thought of it, defined geographically, but it's also with us here. We're part of the African discourse, the African world, and we're all over the place now. I'm in a crazy place called Michigan. So I see the complexity of asking where's the center for Afrocentric thinking, it's with us in our conversation, and we're now in spaces around the world. So I yield to the voice of Texas. From Michigan yields to Texas. I'll tell you. So I'll end on that.
Thank you very much. It's now my pleasure to call on Alidou to make our opening remarks, 7 to 10 minutes. Thank you.
Hello, good morning, everyone, from everywhere we are. And it's a great honor to be invited by Oga Professor Toyin Falola to be part of this celebration of our eminent seniors, Professors Richard Joseph and Professor Ken Harrow. So I want to say that generation like mine are coming behind so many decades after, and we are forever grateful for the foundations you have set, the ethical foundation of solidarity across fields, human solidarity across continents, across diversity, our diversity of identities, and philosophical orientation. Your generation have set model for us, and I accepted the invitation to be part of this celebration of both of you with a great sense of humility and a great sense of gratitude, to say thank you for all you have done to make the field that and create space for some of us to be here. Here, whether it is in the US, whether it is in Africa, in Europe, in Asia, all over the world. So many of the students whose life you have touched are all over the world, and we are all serving every different parts. Some of us have not been directly your students in your classes, but I can tell you I have been your student too, because when you look at my work, some people who will use my work or the work of other people who are part of my generation, they will know your mark. So Professor Ken Harrow, I want to say with a lot of gratitude, express my gratitude. My work on Muslim women in Niger, in the Sahel, or in Kenya have benefited a lot from your own work on Islam and women and feminism, and also cultural studies, the literary and the cultural studies, and the cinema studies. So the modes of seeing Africa, the modes of viewing Africa, the modes of creating space for the imaging of Africa in the diversity, and for women actors, agents to have a space within a world where when people write about Africa, and especially Muslim women, most often it is the story of oppression. So I'm really very grateful to you for your work that I have been inspired by, and I have used both in my teaching and also in my writing. And I want to thank you for that. And so I want to also thank Professor Richard Joseph. Your work as a political scientist, as historian too, of African politics, looking at areas of conflict and looking at providing us with resources to think critically about transition, how to manage transition across our complex communalities and differences, and to inform also the global powers, how to think of Africa, how to see Africa in its complexity within politics. I've been very inspired by your work in the sense of reading it and looking at your endeavor to really push the African agenda for peacemaking and peace building and for conflict prevention. It's it meant a lot to me, and also the generation of scholars who have been using your work. So peace is a complex, peace is as complex as the conflict itself. But how to invest in it, we need the resources, intellectual resources, to think critically across time. So for me, the comparative perspective, what it means to read, for instance, your work in South Africa or your work in Nigeria and transition, and to reflect upon what is going on in the Sahel right now, and also in the Congo, or in Sudan, or in African relationship in international crisis like what we are experiencing now in the Middle East, in Israel and Palestine, is very important. So I want to thank you for that. And I forever grateful to Oga for the opportunity for us to think of peace, to think of how to celebrate each other across time, across generation, and how to foster dialogue. So as your junior, my training is as a linguist. I was trained by linguists such as Professor Paul Newman at Indiana University, who has been really fundamental. Professor Paul Newman, Professor Eckhard Ward, have come to Niger in the Sahel. I like to put the Sahel first, Niger, Francophone country, to try to support the creation and the capacity building in training in linguistics. But what was very important in that call from Nigerian linguists themselves, like Professor Abdou Hamani and others who accompanied that mission, was to think of a discipline, a linguistic discipline, which was not defined by only one school of thought. So that the school of thought that they promoted is to create a linguistic space where all school of thought, including the African School of Linguistics, European School of Linguistics, and Asian School of Linguistics will contribute to the foundational training. So when I come to the US to work with Professor Newman at Indiana University, that sense of what it is to do linguistics by bringing Africa into it, and by African scholarship, African thought in theoretical linguistics, was very fundamental. So within the American traditions, most department of linguistics privilege one school of thought, which is the generative school of thought. So African studies actually become the space where linguistics in all different school of thought, theoretical school of thought, are possible. And linguistics relationship, a transdisciplinary engagement, because our foundational training, coming as Africanists from Niger, being trained by both Nigerians who are in conversation with Americans who studied African languages and who are invested in the promotion, centering of African languages in a mode of knowledge production. It was African studies becomes the space where I can see myself as I was finishing my dissertation, rather than just being stuck in one discipline. So it was important to say, what is the role of a linguist who is interested in bringing the voice of African women? Because we are talking about different paradigm of interpreting African societies. But for some of us who would like to present African women through other modes of knowledge production, other modes of philosophical thought, articulated in African languages and articulated in African scripts and other literacy systems. We want to displace the dominant notion, a narrow notion of literacy only as related to Latinization and only as related to masculinity. So my shift to African studies and my shift to also women's studies within African studies to look critically at how are the diversity of women experiences are presented within complex histories and within complex notions of modernity beyond Eurocentric model of modernity and beyond notions of globalization only as related to Europe, but globalization of the longue durée, to see the ways in which African women and gender studies are framed within those studies. So this is what led me to come to African studies in the mid-1990s to see a home more than in my original disciplinary field, which is theoretical linguistics, but moving to say, I do better by really centering myself in a field that is interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, and that's allowed me to engage different theoretical frameworks and different methodologies and different data coming from African sources in our complexities. So to be a woman in the Sahel, which is a crossroads of civilization, what is the language that we produce? What are the data that we produce in theorizing about women's agency, women's autonomy, and women's contribution to knowledge production, and also in different fields, not only in the humanities and social sciences, but also in natural sciences and other spaces. So to me, as a linguist, interested in how language is produced to represent women in African societies, outside, within and outside Eurocentric paradigms, and also outside narrow Afrocentric essentialist models, will become very critical for me in trying to say it is important to move more towards African studies in a broader sense, and also to have a notion of Africa that is both the continent as a place, but also the continent in its relation with the diversity of worlds that it inhabits and the diversities of history that Africa produces and that also come to be mapped on Africa. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. You've given us an introduction that will generate a lot of questions from me and also maybe from members of the audience. For those of you who have been raising your hands to talk, it is not time. As I said in the beginning, we are going to create the time for the audience to speak. Richard Joseph, it's your turn to introduce yourself and your discipline and your achievements in 10 minutes. Thank you.
All right, thank you all very much. It's indeed a great pleasure to be on this program today. Professor Ken Harrow and I have gotten to know each other remotely since we were both named to be recipients of the Distinguished Africanist Award at the African Studies Association. And so in a few weeks, we'll be gathering in San Francisco and continuing the conversations that are taking place here. Let me, of course, begin by thanking Professor Toyin Falola. He had me featured last May on this program, so I've had an opportunity to share ideas and also some responses. And my comments, my start-off comments today, very much emerge from the Toyin Falola interviews. As he knows and others would know, I'm usually on here on the Sundays when it is offered. So let me begin with a comment that was made by Professor Ola Yakub Haliso last May, when she said to me, and I remember her words, "We want to hear from you, Prof." And, I really interpreted that. We want to hear from you. We want to hear about your experiences. We want to understand your perceptions. We want to see why you have produced the work that you have produced. And I had a similar message that came to me just months ago. And this was from a Cameroon, France historical commission that was set up with the mandate to find out what happened in Cameroon. Why was the independence struggle in Cameroon? Why was it met with so much violence, so much repression? And they are looking at the period 1945 to 1971. And it turns out that the works that I did on that period and asking those questions are very much fundamental to their work. So I'm sending this out as a message, especially to a lot of young scholars, about how the work that they are doing can turn out to be of some significance in terms of our understanding of ourselves and of the world, the global powers, even understanding of us. And I'm speaking about myself here as as an African who happened to have been born in the diaspora. Professor Harrow, some words that he used, I want to pick up. One, complexity. And he talked about complexity in terms of his own work, in terms of literature and art and cinema. And I think you could apply that word to my work, my world. And that is the complexity of African state and politics and governance. And I was very much transformed in my thinking as a result of being engaged in Africa. I had the highest level of learning, in the United States, Dartmouth College, and in France, the University of Grenoble, and at Oxford University. But it was my engagement in Africa that is responsible for really the content and quality of the work I produced. Now, if I have time, I have a little exhibit behind me here. You can see it over my shoulder. And you will see there are two piles of books. And one has to do with my Cameroon work. And the other one has to do with my Nigeria work. Now, my Cameroon work, I had to leave it behind as soon as I published my first article about what I was actually studying. So I was actually able to do that work in a context in which that kind of research was not permissible, right? The study of the independence movement, and under a regime that came to power very much shaped by opposition and especially French repression of that movement. All right, so there's one pile of books there in which I was able to have significant progress because, and this word came up in the Toyin Falola very interesting interview last week on literature and digital, and the experience, the word came up of ecosystem that was used. So African studies might seem to be something that is immediately understood, those who study Africa. But there are ecosystems that exist. Right? The Toyin Falola interview is an ecosystem. On my own campus, there is an ecosystem of a long existing program of African studies. And those of you who were present at ASA in 2018 and heard this very probing, penetrating, provocative presidential lecture by Jane Allman. And her lecture was talking about Melville Herskovits, right? The role he played, but also of the patterns of engagement that people who studied with him underwent. And I was listening to that, but what she was describing was an ecosystem different from the one in which I was nurtured. Because when the struggles were taking place in the US, having to do with African studies, well, I had been trained by Thomas Lionel Hodgkin. And the people who were very much part of that world were people like Basil Davidson. And I was just even remembering Sean Gervasi, the economist. And so that was a quite different ecosystem that I was part of. And as a consequence, let me see if it will work here. I'll just turn around for a second because I gave you a physical exhibit to show the interest. So over here, right, is where you see my thesis on Cameroon. And then you could see my book published by Oxford University, by Oxford University Press. And then you see the French version of my book published. So anyway, all the way up here, the ways in which that work was able to be brought forward, like I said, in a very supportive ecosystem that was in sync with my thinking. I describe myself as a scholar activist, and I've remained one to this day. And this is why the issues in Africa is one that is represented so much in my teaching and writing and so on. But I also have this file here, and I put for you, right? And you will see this giant volume here on the bottom. And then you have my book published by Cambridge University Press, Democracy and Prebendal Politics. And then you have Wally Adebonwi and Ebenezer Obadere version. But the point I want to make now, this line here is one in which I came back to the US, having done my work on Cameroon, and now having this pioneering work I had done in Nigeria. And it's work that I had done in Nigeria, I had access like, few other people, except for Nigerians themselves had. I was teaching University of Ibadan and be able to travel around. Prof has mentioned about the conference in Awolowo and, just that experience. But let me just tell you what happened. And it's the first time I'm saying this. When I came back to the US in 1979 to join Dartmouth, and then I wanted to have my next major work. The first one was published by Oxford University Press, and I wanted it published in the US. And the people who I saw as my predecessors, James Coleman, Sylvester Whitaker, Richard Sklar, and they all published with Princeton University Press. And I thought, well, that's where I wanted to publish. And so I was in communication with Princeton University Press, and I thought I was well on my way to have this work thing. Well, guess what happens? A few months after I finally sent it to them, it came back to me. This great big volume arrived back to me from Princeton University Press. They sent it to one person, and that one person trashed it. And Princeton University Press, instead of looking over and say, why is this guy objecting to this work? We can see what it is. No, they decided to just send it back to me. But I couldn't take a chance, all right? Because I was entering the American system. There was tenure ahead and all of that. So what I had to do was I had to go back to the British ecosystem of African studies that I knew. And the book was immediately picked up by Cambridge University Press. And as you know, the rest is history. All right, so what point am I getting to? What we call African studies consists of ecosystems. And those ecosystems can sometimes become enclaves. And those enclaves, to use a word that Holland Cotter in a recent review of the exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art on Africa and Byzantium, he used these words that were very resonant. He talked about gates and fences and fences. And so there are gates that open and you can enter. And at every stage of your career, certain things can happen and can take place. You can get jobs, you can get fellowships, right? You can get all of those things. But there are situations in which they are not gates, they are fences. You are shut off. And they operate in that way. But unfortunately, what has happened in some segments of African studies is not only have they shut off ways of thought, ways of approaching, and so on, they have also shut off the valves that would bring dynamism to what they are doing. And as a consequence, they are stifled. And let me conclude, because again, when we had I was featured, the term state capture came up, and Prof pushed me about it. Well, I want to say there's not only state capture, there's also studies capture. There's also stories capture. Now, in the case of Cameroon, let me conclude here, because Professor Harrow mentioned Achille Mbembe. All right. Well, I met Achille Mbembe when I started doing my research. And it's Achille Mbembe who did the revision of my French translation of my book. As you know, he's a master in the French language. But also, I'm the person who made it possible for Achille Mbembe come to the University of Wisconsin with Crawford Young to acquire his fluency in English. So we open gates, and we have to continue to do so. But be very mindful that people who sometimes have the power within those systems are not looking at what is right for Africa. They're not looking at what is the real value of this work. Often they're looking to protect something they're doing, have been doing. And if they do that for too long, as has happened in some of our centers, they've ended just fading, right? Losing their dynamism. And I'm so glad to see all the young people who are coming along. Professor Alidou, you are there. To see Professor Ousseina in South Africa. To see Professor Chika Okeke coming along. And you are following on the footsteps, of course, of the great Toyin Falola. You all are revolutionizing our discipline and these areas of study. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Here now comes the difficult part for the three of you, in which we'll follow up on what you have said. Please bring all of them forward so that they can take questions and answer them in turn. Try to remove me if possible. So you've put a wrong person there. You've put a wrong person there. You want to put Ken. Okay, so let me start with where Joseph tries to end. Now, thanks, Ken. And I will pose the question this way: to what extent does African studies serve Africa? Any of you can start, but the three of you, you have to answer the question in your own way. To what extent as African studies serve Africa? Who wants to go first, please? Ken, you want to go first?
Sure, he says you. Do you want to go first?
Well, that's a hard question. Why do you, I get the hard.
That's why I'm posing it.
I think of African studies as a conversation. I think, Richard Joseph's final comments were the ones that resonate with me. And I want to also thank Alidou for her complimentary words. They really make me happy, make me smile all day long, all week long. Thank you so much. So I think, when Richard talked about gates, basically gates that open or that shut, that barriers or not. I think serving Africa will be served as anywhere on earth will be served when we have conversations that are enabled. That's the truth. That if we feel blocked and can't share our thoughts, if we feel who knows. I mean, I feel blocked right now in saying what will the blocks be, because it leads us to very delicate and difficult issues, especially in changes that have taken place in the American Academy, and they've become very delicate issues. So I want to say, okay, we have powerful and really ugly forces that we need to stand up to. We saw them on the screen at the beginning, and it really that brought me to mind when James Baldwin met Chinua Achebe in Florida at our ALA conference. We had the first meeting of these two great writers, and some racist got the microphone, and we all stood up in that motel where the speech was being given. We raised our fists like that, and we said, "We're going to continue. We're not going to let them stop us from talking." So really, Toyin, I think the answer is it takes a bit of courage to be able to speak up often in our field, because we're going up against people who might disagree and might accuse us of all kinds of things if they don't like the approach that we're taking. But the gate has to be open for relatively open conversations, right? That's how I feel. I think Richard's comments made me think strongly. We have to have conversations that are open, that enable other people to respond to our thoughts. That will serve Africa best, in my view.
Alidou, please.
Thank you so much, both profs, and thank you for your question. African studies is critical to Africa, in my humble opinion. Looking at the ways in which knowledge within the institution called the school, the cultural production of the educated person since the advent of European colonialism and the introduction of European school system has produced a way of seeing Africa that has to be revisited. And so looking at African studies from a decolonized perspective is very important for Africa. And now when I say Africa within the continent and Africa everywhere, it is possible. So I'm coming from the history of being produced out of the Francophone experience. I know more in this trajectory of my training in K through 12, what will be interpreted as a K through 12. I will know more authors or knowledge system that are more associated to Europe than authors and scientists who are from Africa, from the locality where I was born, where I'm studying. I will not know that, but I will know from somewhere else. I'll give you one simple example. If I am studying botany, I will know more La Fougère, European plants, environments in the laboratory more than the African laboratory, the African environment. That's as how it was. So to me, when I think of African studies, I'm not only thinking in terms of this infrastructure here in the global north where I'm located. I'm thinking of African studies across time and in any space, what it is that why is it important to center Africa? As Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o would say, decolonizing the mind. African studies is important not only for the Africans, but to see the ways in which Africa is contributing to the well-being of the humanity, not only of people of African descent, but any geography. And any space. So to not understand Africa in a decolonized perspective, and what African mind, African space has to offer to the world becomes a problem. So if the African, whether it's in the continent or in the diaspora, and I'm considering all of us here as the African, as Professor Ken Harrow also said, how do we see, is it Africa as a relational? I think it becomes very important for us to center in investing in knowing what Africa has to offer to the world, both through the humanities, the social sciences, the natural science, any science, and the art. So the movement for STEM, for instance, I say, how unfortunate if we don't consider it as STEM to incorporate art and also African cosmology and philosophies, so that we interpret how science and its relationship to art and spirituality offer something from an African perspective to the world. And which is not also to think of Africa so the complexity of Africa, our diversities and our communalities, but not to think of Africa in an essentialist way, because Africa also needs to learn from the world. Africa is in the world. So other parts of the world have produced knowledge system that a dialogue centered on Africa, but Africa in relationship to the multiple ecosystems of knowledge in the world is very critical. Then to have an African studies where the understanding of that relationship is seen through an essentialist and narrow way. So that's why I think it's very critical that we reinvest in the study of Africa, because as also paradigm of extractivism across the history of longue durée has extracted more knowledge from Africa in a very exploitative way. At the same time, it denies the authority of the copyright to know that this knowledge system actually comes from Africa. So those are the kind of ways that we have to balance that. And also to look at what Professor Toyin followed, we talk about marginal identities. How within Africa themselves, the many Africans themselves, if we look at those many Africa themselves, the marginal identities need to be addressed in order for us to not see Africa in an essentialist way, in a way that does not address the issues of power relations within itself, that, as Chinua Achebe said, colonialism did not succeed. European colonialists did not succeed only because of militarism and the machine gun. But colonialism, in my reading of Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, happens because internally Africa has made itself vulnerable, where there are some category of beings who are disposable, like the Osu, etc., etc. Right? So it is important for me to rethink what do we mean when we say Africa and Africans, therefore, for African studies, for it to be empowering for Africa, those areas of marginalization, dispossession, the category of beings, women, other ethnicities, other geographies, who is allowed, as Professor Richard said, when is the gate open, and who is admitted in, who is acceptable, who is authorized to speak and to produce knowledge, to get the resources to intervene in African studies. Thank you.
No, let me follow up before I call Richard. So you may not be aware that I visit your country many times. And before the coup, at the level of the government, at the level of the ministerial conversation, I was to host a major conference that your country will sponsor bringing together what they call scholars, Lusophone, Anglophone, Francophone. We already agreed, and a week later, this coup occurred. To be fair to them, because it's a public conversation, the idea is not dead. They still want to do it. And part of the problem is in saying that the current of knowledge comes from France. It doesn't come from even the Anglophone countries, that the students are not even aware of the contributions that those in the other mislabeled Francophone, Lusophone countries, that knowledge has not even penetrated the Nigerian academy. And so, if we have this issue of African studies and Africa, what about the issues of the circulation of knowledge within Africa itself? And it's important to mention, because many people do not know, that for centuries, this circulation had been there across the Sahara. There were people from Niger who went as far as setting up intellectual locations in Cairo. We don't talk about that. And the place where we call Darfur, there are many people from the area of Nigeria, Chad, Niger, who went to live in Darfur, creating their own ethnicity. So how do we revive this circulation within Africa? So that it's not just, as we normally say in this part of the world, south-north, south-north.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, Professor Folola. I think you have touched the heart of the matter of what colonialism and neocolonialism is about in the African space, and especially, so my area now is the Francophone space. This is an area where there are school systems, knowledge systems, literacy systems that have been, that were denied the right to be, and yet they're there. So whether you are in Niger or you are in Mali, you are in Burkina Faso, Senegal, all these countries where you have the Muslim societies, the Islamic societies. And before even the Islamic societies, there were other ethnicities, other cultures with a literacy system, like the Amazigh people, the Tuareg people have a literacy in Tifina, right? And so the Tifina literacy is something that actually women impart. When we talk about the history of how literacy is transferred, in the Latinization world, Latin alphabet, whether you are dealing with Europe or Africa, the transmission of literacy comes through a gendered understanding, and it is male dominated. Whereas if we are looking at the history of literacy in Tuareg's culture, for instance, the Amazigh, Tifinar is transmitted by the grandmothers to them. So literacy there outside Latinization and outside even the Arabic Islamic script. When we look at gender relations and transmission of literacy, it's different when we study the Sahel closely. And then you map it now to the relationship between the intervention of Islam and the production of a literacy system that have become indigenized, where the development of Ajami literacy, to which women contribute to. And in fact, if we are to look at how institution of learning, Islamic universities, women have contributed. A woman was the philanthropist who enabled the development of the University of Sankore. So this is to say that deep history allow us to know that Africans in that landscape where forces such as Boko Haram will say Western education is not allowed, right? We can challenge that argument if deep critical investment in African studies is promoted in a landscape whereby the people who have been alienated from knowing what their own cultural space historically has produced can enable them to do. So it is a disempowerment for not investing first in knowing deep history, deep resources that are indigenous. So indigenous capability, indigenous knowledge system, and in encounter with other knowledge system. So the same space have welcomed Europeans who came to study, to philosophize, and that's the same medieval Africa in its renaissance. So if medieval Africa can allow, for instance, Judaica, the Christian world beyond the Abrahamic religion, whether it's Judaica, Christianity, and Islam to converge, and to have globalization beyond that space for greater Asia, China, and India, and other spaces to come there and exchange. What is it that up to the 21st century, neocolonialism and elite, indigenous elites who absorb coloniality do not create spaces to reinterrogate so that resources can be invested to allow the African youth and all of us and the humanities, no matter where we are, to benefit from an equality of access to resources and also recognition of human dignity in knowledge production and resource sharing. This is what is the crisis in the Sahel at the moment. And as a scholars, I want to, I appreciate what Philoun Sarr is doing in addressing the crisis in Senegal by engaging intellectuals and scholars and artists to come to his platform to have a conversation. And he made a statement that addressed directly scholars and academicians, that there is as an academicians operating within the university, we have to address knowledge and to share information in an ethical, honest way. It is different to produce knowledge, to impart knowledge as a politician. So I'm speaking here as an academician. And I think an academician intervening within an ethical framework to say the crisis can be revisited by examining power relations between Africa and the global forces intervening in the Sahel in an extractive way, and also what elite within the systems have been doing since independence to the present time.
Thank you. Thank you. I love your extensive answer. Richard.
Yes. All right. Thank you. I'll be very brief because I know you have an amazing group of people, especially young people that we want to get on. So South Africa.
No, you don't have to be brief for now, please. You don't have to be brief.
I don't. Yes, I'll be very brief. So I just wanted to say the South Africa and is, you know, really what is going on in Africa now. And I want to stress really two things. The first thing is the young people. And the young people, in terms of what is happening with the demography, as you all will know what those figures are in terms of it, but also with the young people who are fleeing the continent. And we know what tragedies, you know, they are really taking on. And I think that is something that needs to be addressed. And the second thing, the word knowledge is being used in a whole variety of rather interesting, exotic ways. But knowledge in terms of what has happened to the educational systems in the continent, and also the fact of, you know, the knowledge that is built up outside of Africa. And the circulation you mentioned, Prof, about it is circulation within Africa, but also circulation from the knowledge built up in the archives, in the libraries, in the professoriate outside of Africa. And that's one of my critical concerns of how do we make that and I call that collaborative learning, that we really need that now based on what's happening in the educational sector. Thank you.
So let me provoke you on what I call counter discourse as a political scientist. So when you wrote your book on Nigeria, so you said prebendal state.
Mm.
And over the years, we spend a lot of time in the characterization of states. And each time we have to respond in what I call a time-wasting mechanism. On Monday is the prebendal state by Richard Joseph. Tuesday, the vampire state. Wednesday, the irrelevant state. Thursday, the kleptocratic state. Friday, the ungovernable state. As we respond to all these labels, Joseph, are we being diverted from the real work?
All right, very, very quickly there. This came up, of course, in our last session. The state is inevitable, goes all the way back to Hobbes, all right? And Hafsat Abiola said something very important when she said that, the state systems, the politics, the governance, they have not been working. And the question is the design. And I really take that very seriously. This is why I talk about the whole process of reimagining Africa. You have this colonial imprint in Africa, but you also have several decades now of post-colonial entities, and we know what that has been. And I think right now, this is a very critical era. I think we only probably got, a few years to really grapple with this, because the continent cannot continue to be drifting the way it is, people feeling the way they are doing. And then you have these coups occurring. The coups are occurring, and this came up in one of your programs because of the popular dissatisfaction, even with the so-called democratic system. So I really feel this is a really critical area. Let me bring Ken in here, because I am a strong believer that these cultural resources, it's not just the social sciences, the cultural resources and practices and production are going to be so very critical to that process of reimagining and redesign and re-empowering. So I'll stop there, and I'd love to hear Ken coming in on this.
Sorry, can I say a word then?
Yes.
Actually, as Alidou was speaking, it occurred to me that when you asked this question of observing, I would do better if I spoke in the areas that I know, and Richard pointed directly to them. This is I'm going to put this not as an answer, but as a quandary and a question. So, as I keep saying, my areas are literature and cinema. So we have been struggling from the start, in both creating an audience for African literature on the continent and an audience for African cinema. And the cinema, it's really easy, because when I say from the start, I'm thinking back to the Semben in the 1960s and 70s. You say, where were Africans going to be able to see the movies that African filmmakers were making? I don't want to give a big lecture here. I could just tell you it was a locked up system where European and American direct distributors had a hold on which films would be distributed pretty much around the world. And it became really hard for an African filmmaker to get his or her films seen on the continent. It was a lot easier to go to film festivals and then try to get universities abroad, like American universities, to pick up their film. That problem is still with us, and it's shifted. It's morphed. Now we have platforms like Amazon and Netflix and the rest. So okay, great. Some Nollywood films are now being shown on Netflix. So now Netflix has got its algorithms. They're making these films 90 minutes long. They follow a trajectory that's familiar to, quote, world cinema, and the Africanity, the African-centered way of creating films that had begun in the 90s Nollywood has morphed radically into a kind of anodyne pattern. The problem is even accentuated while you're talking about African languages. Think about the immense problem of creating a readership, not just people who are going to read novels in African languages, but more importantly, and this is the main point I want to make, who are the publishers who are going to take on the costs of publishing such books and then try to get an audience to pay for it? That's our problem. That's a central, absolute problem that we face, and its response to Richard's question. Yes, the production of culture, of films and of literature is continuing by African authors, both on and off the continent, and we need to think really hard how every kind of subsidy, every kind of support for authors that continue this even famous authors like Boris Jupp are going to write in Wolof. How is he going to get his work read by Wolof readers? The minute those books like the works of Ngugi are written in Kikuyu, the minute they're written in Kikuyu, they're translated into English and sold by a publisher who can make money. Then we have to figure out a way of centering the culture economically in a global age. And that's my question, the challenge here, to which I don't have a good answer. I know for us, it's been a key issue in our fields from the beginning. And there are lots of little answers, but I don't know. I think we have to put our heads together to answer that question. Toya, and you've addressed that question in your work, your labors, right, over the years. How do we think about getting these works accessible to an audience and getting an audience who would be interested in it, having access to our literature and to our cinema?
So I want to pick from what Alidou said previously to pose a question to Ken. How do we expand the canon of African literature, making use of African languages? In Alidou's response, she was mentioning Ajami and other voices. So what would you suggest in terms of first expanding the canon and second integrating them with respect to those who write in African languages?
Well, to answer the question properly, you have to say, whose canon are we talking about? Who decides what constitutes the canon? And that becomes really, you have no, well, you do have an idea how absolutely difficult it is to bring, for example, scholars at African universities to the point where they're going to ground their work in indigenous language production. They're going to ask, where can I publish my articles or my books on these topics? Where can I get an audience? Or even more, where will my university be paying me to enable me to do it? But even more than that, I'm going to go back to a case that I know and that Richard Joseph can speak to. Do you have any idea how hard it was to get departments of African literatures accepted? Of course, we know the struggle that Ngugi went through. He made that famous. But it's true, especially, I think, Alidou, I'd say even more in the Francophone world, where there was such a lock on the idea that literature began with, Molière or something, that the prestige of the European language literature made it extremely difficult, even in European languages, for African literature to be taught. So when I'm thinking of Richard, I'm thinking way back to in Cameroon, where that first Department of African Literature and Language was created. It was by compromises that were made with the government that allowed the Anglophone section of the country to come into a kind of political compromise with the Francophone side, and so that got settled when the Department of African Literature and Language was formed in Cameroon. And so there was some Anglophone stuff that was allowed, like Cameroon Airlines was allowed to be called Cameroon Airlines instead of a French name. That struggle to have a Department of African Literature in Cameroon did not take place in a place where it should have from the beginning, Gerard Diop, at the university in Dakar. How come? And I know the answer. If there was such a tight lock on the French language and French educational system there, that it became extremely difficult, even though there were great minds and scholars, to have a department that would focus on African literatures and indigenous, much less. It became the work of IFAN instead of in the university. So I think this knowledge production, the struggle at the university level to create scholars and audiences, it's not the only answer. Certainly for cinema, we have to go beyond that. But those are the questions where I find it difficult. And I was struggling to think of the name. It was Bernard Fonlin, Richard, who was the one who made that Department of African Literature possible. And he did it by bringing in the Anglophone side of Cameroon. And Ahidjo accepted that and allowed that department. I was there when that happened in Cameroon. But it was an anomaly, I think, at least within the Francophone world in Africa.
Yeah, if I thank you
Go
so
ahead.
much,
Please go
Professor
ahead.
Harrow. If I may add a little bit on to respond to add to what Professor Harrow is saying. One area in that the canon was challenged. So this the university is challenged, and the formal schooling system that is elitist is challenged through one concrete example. When Nollywood started, it has recentered African languages, and it has produced the opportunity for people who emerge out of the formal schooling system to say, we are going to be cultural agents, cultural producers who will value African culture, African languages, and utilize the medium of filming to produce cheap films that are entertaining to Africans, that allow the imaging of Africans, for Africans to consume Africans. So I remember at the early stage of Nollywood, going to Niger and seeing everywhere in every neighborhood, people, communities being glued to this TV of neighborhood or in homes because they're watching Nigerian Nollywood. So it started with one cultural area, but then it spread in Nigeria, and it built the confidence in other African countries that we too can produce with our cheap cameras locally consumable African content that are very creative, that bring African orality, African literariness, African dramaturgy at play and consume. So when we talk about the contribution of African cultural producers through the creative industry, African youth have shown that the canon can be challenged. But now whether there is a government will. So this is where the politicians who control resources, who should allow African youth, the creative mind, which have produced something that transform. For instance, Nigeria come up, the GDP went up, placed Nigeria as the first African economy, not because of petrol. It is the creative industry has done something to it, and scientifically it is there. So it is whether the Africans, the confidence of African leadership, when Professor Richard Joseph is talking about the governance, we cannot only talk about how imperialism, well, we're not a project of imperialism. There is no capitalist system that will say we are going to empower you. No, the capitalist system will empower itself and its own population and its own need. But it's for Africa to have a reflexive look at herself and say, what do we need in terms of governance that produces an economy, an economic system that serves Africans, not an economic system that subordinates the African. And this is where the crisis can be resolved. The youth do not have to go and migrate and through the Sahara or the Mediterranean. The youth will stay and continue to produce. Why is it that now the Africa that in the early 80s, the economists said, this is a doomed continent. Now everybody is coming to Africa. Where Niger, which is considered one of the poorest countries of the world, why is it that now it is all of a sudden so important that a crisis is happening? It is because it has something. It is whether African themselves, Nigerian themselves, Sahelian themselves, Congolese in the Sudan, everywhere, in North Africa, everywhere, whether there is a sense of what a Cameroonian economist called the sense of self-confidence to see the good in Africa, not only Africa in the continent, but Africa in the diasporas, and Africa like us here saying there is something critical, important happening. And the most important capital is not only money or the extractive, it is the human capabilities. And whether we are investing in that human capability to develop self-confidence so that Africa and African studies will make sense to everybody.
Thank you, but let me provoke you. How will you respond to the criticism, Alidou, that feminism is destroying African studies?
It is possible. It is possible if it is imperialist. And I will agree with a philosopher Nkiru Nzegwe that if feminism, we understood it with the issue of inequalities in not recognizing hegemony, in not recognizing we are family of women, but one family of women is alienated within a system of labor production that is not interrogated. So it becomes problematic. But if feminism means the respect of the dignity of all women, regardless of geographies, regardless of race, the notion of equality of dignity is honored. I cannot see how it will be a problem for Africa. The problem is there is still resistance because people are still seeing those who do not embrace feminism, they're still saying the problem of inequalities, the problem of hegemony, the problem of imperialism, to which global north, and now even within the BRICS also has its own hierarchical structure, which I do not essentialize because we are Southern, that it necessarily means that there is no those hierarchy. As long as that there is an imperialistic relationship, power relations within women and gender, and we talk about marginal identities, then it becomes problematic. If it is egalitarian in a recognition of dignity and in recognition of collaborating equally to the struggle to dismantle inequalities, then I think it is an ethical approach to life, which I embrace. So for those who are seeing it as a problem, it's because it's there. And it's also because it does not absorb the complexity of how, for instance, one of the great intervention of Oyewumi's Ronke's book, The Invention of Women, why it becomes important, because it produces a framework that allows us to interrogate those hegemonic grammar of gender that does not recognize other possibilities in other modes of thinking, especially in African societies, right? So it becomes an interventionist book, regardless of whether we agree totally with it or not. But it was very important to say it is possible to, so far, this system of thinking women and gender did not incorporate other grammars of interpretation of gender sexuality within their own cultural, historical, and contemporary and notions of futures. And one category of thoughts cannot be imposed on our grammar of being.
Joseph, there's a conversation in the African Union that we should rearrange grant writing, book publication. And the way they are framing it is, when you write a book or when a grant is approved, from the view of the AU, why do we think it has to be strictly academic? Why not policy? So they're beginning to create a matrix. What is it you are contributing to local people? What is your project contributing to development and progress on the continent? And I've seen initial documents, I've participated in that debate. For those who are based, say, in European American universities, that is not the way they frame questions, which will raise some tensions and some disagreements. How will you respond to what the EU is trying to provoke in this kind of conversation?
Well, thank you. I am not familiar with the African Union in regard to this question, but I'll certainly try to become informed. But so I pick up the question. I think it has been an issue in African studies, maybe, and also in perhaps other areas of academia, of drawing a strict line between policy work and scholarship. And as a result, the policy world tends to disregard what the academics are doing, and the academic world sometimes can, get into an echo chamber and not want to take up, the pertinence in what is happening, especially with a lot of the major challenges. Now, as you will know from me and my work and so on, I have always seen that that there should not be this iron wall between the two. As a matter of fact, if you look at the African Studies at Emory University, it's called the Institute of African Studies. I was the founding director. I was at Emory and at the Carter Center. And it was called the Institute for the very reason that I aspired to have some policy issues also taken up within academia. So I think that this is a conversation that should be taken up, because I think it's a very important one. You can't have a situation where a content has such major challenges in all the areas we know: environmental, climate change, economic, and so on and go forth. And you're building up an African studies that is somehow unable to connect to those needs and those issues. So I am on board to take on that challenge, even though I can't really put it in the context of what the African Union is proposing. Thank you.
Well, Ken, I'll just follow it up on that, because people are saying the PhDs being produced in American academies are not useful in Africa. That the topics they are making these younger people do have nothing to do with the nation-state projects. They just say, okay, go and study whatever you like, without considering the needs of Africa, its concerns. How will you respond to that?
Well, I suppose it continues with the question of what we consider the needs of Africa. Alidou keeps coming back to the questions of ethics and producing knowledge in an ethical fashion. So I should hope that, I'll speak for myself. I don't think that needs are met on purely technical or mechanistic or mechanical or material terms. They are in a sense, unless we have peace, unless we have food, we can't have culture. But on the other hand, we can't think of human development of the expansion of what makes us human outside of the broader ethical and humanist issues. How much is this? Do we do that in the academy today? I think the academy, it's not simply it's an echo chamber, but it's a relatively narrow chamber. It's also, I'll say some positive things as well, because some of the more recent scholarship I've seen, and I've only seen a bit, has increasingly turned our fields towards the question of the material, so that even when we have literary or cinematic criticism, we're looking more and more at the material side. Sometimes the material side seems so abstract. For example, what is the materiality of cinema? How is it different when it's become virtual or when it was celluloid or things? We look at the concreteness of the materiality. But on the other hand, you can't really separate that from something like the production of film, as in Nollywood. And once we've looked at that, once we start taking seriously those questions of materiality, they extend everywhere to the way in which a literary or a cultural world concerns itself with atomic energy and with Niger and its uranium. These become, it's really critical now that we understand this interdisciplinarity, not to be simply reduced to major categories of, let's say, feminist studies along with class studies, but also the materiality of production in the fullest sense. I don't want production. I don't want the whole scientific world. That's my interest right now. I don't want the production of knowledge in the scientific world, which is phenomenal, to become separated from the production of knowledge culturally. And if it's a cultural knowledge, it takes into account the broadest spheres of knowledge, for sure, that will ultimately prove to the ecological benefit of Africa as well as outside of Africa. In fact, it can't be one separate from the other. That's the one thing about that, the word that Richard kept using, the ecologies of knowledge. There should be no border on this notion of ecology, just as the way we think we all breathe air. And the air in Africa, it's the same. But I'm going to also contradict myself, a little bit of a distinction as well about this production. I can't help but think about not that long ago, when I was concerned with globalization and the way in which Africa was coming out of the new press of neoliberalism with negative economic consequences. I was all concerned with how those theoretical issues determined, in fact, the novels that we read and how we talked about culture. And then that year, it was 2006, I think, we went back to Dakar and I got off the plane. I can only say it kind of, everything felt different. And after being in Dakar for a couple of months, I began to see the world from the point of view, a little bit, of the Taliban on the street who are there every day in front of my face, in front of our fingers. That changed the perspective. It really did. And it's in that location where we want our production of knowledge to answer your question. I don't want to make it too trivial, but like you could ask that question, say, Ken, what good is this novel doing for the Taliban? And for the Taliban. No, for the Taliban. For the Taliban on the street. Okay, that's a hard question. Let's not let go of that question whenever we talk about the theories of neoliberalism. Come back to that question. And that will extend to the kind of ethical dimension of the work that Alidou is asking us to emphasize. Okay.
Alidou, let me provoke you. So I have made a suggestion, repeated over and over again. Why can't African universities create new disciplines? Disciplines based on what they've accumulated over the years, the enormous epistemologies they can convert to theories, the retraining students in a different ways. And I've proposed 3 ideas. Why can't they have a department of kingship? where that is what we've had for centuries. And when the late Alafia Foyo died, and I went to give a keynote, and I said, why couldn't we have a discipline called Alaphinology or Obaship or something? Because that knowledge has depth, it has enormous resources. And that by converting it into a discipline, it will do precisely what others have done in other cultures. The creation of theories that others can use. And I've also said, okay, why is a body of knowledge, if Father, we're talking on December 3rd, why is it not a standalone discipline? Awarding degrees from BA to PhD. And I've provoked people, why don't you have a department of witchcraft, which 2 universities now do? And in Britain, a university just started a program on magic and occultism. And the argument is, if you have all these established practices over centuries, why are they not operating at the university level? Not just grafted to one, say, the Shimofobomosho, you grafted to history as a department, department. Why not their own autonomous disciplines?
Thank you so much, Prof. Okay, if we are thinking of insularity, the university, we just have to look at even here in the global north where we are located, the 4 of us. Insularity is a problem. What I mean by insularity, if I take the example of Niger or Senegal or the Francophone, if the university system in its conception is not open to other modes of thinking the university, right? In the comparativity that this paradigm inherited from the colonial legacy. Yes, it's one system. The same way I take the example that when the Department of Linguistics in Niger was being created, if there is one thing that I love after the system, the Department of Linguistics in Niger, as opposed to the Department of Linguistics in the Americas, is that the creation of the Department of Linguistics in Niger allowed the possibility of all school of thought to be foundational, to be part of the foundational training. Whereas if you come, for instance, in the American setting where I have been, the generative model is the predominant. So you see, so it does not allow the comparativity to emerge and to allow the flourishing for a long time. So any system, whether it's university or any system, when it's so insular that it does not allow its walls to be porous to allow comparativity, to allow other modes of thinking to come and be in dialogue, to be in translation, then it becomes very difficult for that system to see the possibility that other disciplines outside what is colonially inherited need to take place. This is what, for instance, the Nobel Prize winner, the late Wangari Maathai, in her approach to the Green Belt movement, as a biologist, plant biologist returning to Africa, see what has happened to the forest, the deforestation. Try to say, no, we have to reclaim indigenous knowledge system and put it in dialogue with a knowledge system that I inherited from my journey into this European system of seeing the environment. And how do we replenish the earth, right? So it becomes critical. And here the work of recent work of Achille Mbembe in saying earthly community, right? How do we build the relationship with Earth so that that very Earth that allow us to exist and we depend on Earth, how do we love Earth to a point where we can become our awareness of the possibility that we can be extant as human beings who are undermining Earth is addressed. So to have a department where witchcraft, what is called witchcraft, where really it's indigenous knowledge and its cosmology and cosmogony relationship with Earth, with the forces of nature, in our symbiosis with them, can be interrogated. This is something that existed in Africa, that's in other parallel, that are knowledge system in the same space where the university exists, but which the university wall does not allow, because it's in anthropology, it's witchcraft. Therefore, it's a primitive primitivity, right? So it will not allow, once it is understood within that kind of mode of seeing, of valuing what is there as a knowledge system, relationship from the indigenous, to translate it, to bring it back into this dominant space called the university and open its wall. And it's difficult. Linguistics here in America had to evolve into cognitive science, into literary linguistics, into other things, because this system here is allowing the walls of the discipline to open. But it started by collaborative interdisciplinary conversations across fields, which in very African university system, there is a rigidity for interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary collaboration. So the discipline inherited became controlling. But when people come outside, they see, oh, this is possible. In other system, you go to Asia, whether it's India or China or Brazil, people are rethinking those borders to be challenged, or in Latin America. But there are a university system in Africa where the discipline does not allow the possibility of collaborating in a transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary way. Thank you.
If we think of universities as both public and as private, and ask that same question about about production of knowledge, but the production of esoteric knowledge, or the production of some narrower field of knowledge, the question that highlights, if I say a private versus a public university, the question could be, who is paying for this production of, who's paying for this canon, who's paying for this discipline, who's paying for the work, who's paying these teachers? We can find the people who can teach it and the students to study it. But once you add to that the question of who's going to be paying their salaries, then we're going to be, that will say, who's going to permit this field to exist? And even at a time now when there's a constriction of the humanities, because in the United States, because of fear that the graduates won't get jobs, the real question then becomes, how do we see the discipline linked to the forces, I would call them the capitalist forces that are dominant, that permit knowledge to be studied and to be produced. So I can't separate whether this is a good thing to have a department of witchcraft. I just read that we have that in English university. They're doing that now already. Somebody in England decided they could pay for it, while at the same time they're squeezing down the English departments because they're not going to pay for that. So all these questions come back to who's paying for it and under what conditions, and why will they pay for it? And that gets tricky. When I say public, I'm thinking of state as opposed to private. And that difference is really interestingly tricky. Who makes the policies for state support of universities? That's a big topic. Maybe I don't think I want to talk because it'll take too long to lay out my thoughts on it. But you know what I'm saying? Where are the restrictions? Who are the gatekeepers once it's a public university? as opposed to private ones.
In 10 minutes, I will bring members of the audience, but before then, Joseph, what do you think of this constant binary, Africa and the West, Africa and the West? Is this binary real? And second, is it allowing us, when we use this Africa and the West all the time, not to talk about Arab racism? Why have we been silent? Why do we just talk about white racism instead of other racisms?
Unmute, Richard.
My brother, you pose a question, and then you structure it with a certain formulation embedded in the question. So if I could take your point and just back it out a little bit more from the Africa and the West but to Africa and the world. I really feel like this now, Africa and the world, and it has come up a lot in your sessions. I think this is a very significant area of reflection. And let me just say a few things very concretely on this score. Let me start off with my brother, Neo Sundari, who sent me a week ago a poem published in The Nation on Ode to Kindness. And I had to extract it from all the adverts there. And when I started doing it, I found myself treating it, it was mentioned, Ken mentioned New Orleans as a standard, right? And I'm staying with our question because Osundare accompanied it with an article on Osundare Goes to Korea and on the translation of his poems into Korean, right? And they've been published. And then I found myself, because of the theme, and this takes you to Professor Alidou, talking about the conflicts and the wars that are taking place, right? And we are assaulted by the horrors that have been going on, right? But it also had on the continent, Ethiopia and Sudan, Ukraine and so on. Why am I saying this? I am saying this because, let me just take this very concrete example of how Africa and the world has always been, Africa has always been their present. You know, they're going back to Byzantium. You have European modern art, which is very much so much Africa in its core. So this is something, this awareness of it. But the point I want to make about with Asundari, and if I have the opportunity, I'll be able to share it with you all, is in fact, I just shared this poem of Osundari, and it provoked such an interest that I started myself producing my own rendition of it, because I thought this is something meant for the world. So I'm saying that Africa and the world, it's almost like recognizing the oxygen that we breathe. The world has always been breathing African oxygen, African music, African design. Today I opened up my Sunday Times, and what do I see? Ralph Lauren, and there's a photograph of a couple, of a black couple, black right there. And you referred to it, Prof, when you talked about what's going on, Afrofusion, Afro beats, and everything else. So, so let me get to my point. I feel like there's a conversation taking place. My brother, Dele Olojide, he's doing it with his Africa in the World in South Africa. I see that, Professor Chika at Princeton is doing an Africa World initiative. And so this idea of being able to see the world in the sense that how the world has always been permeated by Africanity in all of these different dimensions. And I think that's going to be a very powerful force, for our people to realize how much, in fact, we have been very much part of the constructing of what we know as this world. Sorry to have gone on.
Other, any of you can respond to that provocative question?
Well, this is Gekande's argument. In his last couple of books, he does it brilliantly. That Europeans imagine that they constructed a, oh, exactly.
Yeah.
You see that?
No, you can't, but Ken's got the screensaver on. See it? Yeah.
Yeah, this is good. Beautiful. Yes, I had it. Mhm.
So that this is where I find inspiration in Gandhi. We want to think that the dominant thought comes from the top down, and when he talks about slavery, how could slaves themselves, owned by other people, construct the way of thought that their masters had? But Gandhi really he undoes that. He makes the argument, in fact, that as Africans came out into the world, they're not simply as slaves, but in whatever form, in Kenyatta going to England with anthropology and so on, that they were shaping, in fact, they were collaborative in the shaping of the way that the Europeans not only thought of Africans, but that led to the way that Europeans came to think of themselves. I don't know about China, but I know about in France and England, that's true. That there was a collaborativeness. It's always there in some sense. At times it gets diminished, like in the painting of Olympia, where there's the black woman is holding the shade or whatever in the background, but she's there. There's an awareness of that look and of that presence, which is there going back for hundreds of years in the European culture, and it comes to construct the way Europeans think of themselves, the way they want to think of themselves in relationship. Sometimes the way they think of themselves, we look at and say, well, it's just disgusting. It makes them think of themselves as superior. But it's not as that simple as that. Gandhi is really, I think, for me, the light, the guiding light in helping to see that collaborative work is sometimes unconsciously done by people who are surrounded by these cultural elements. And I want to argue for culture, again, as being determinative in the way we construct the human being.
Alidou, should we have African studies in Africa?
We have African studies in Africa, Prof.
Is it necessary? Is it necessary?
Okay, so to me, I come back to the idea of the confidence. It is necessary, but not within a model whereby it's always dictated from outside. So again, power relations. So one of the contention that we are having now, even in whether we keep African studies or ASA America or ASA Africa or ASA China, etc., it's how this power relationship is felt, right? So for any science, for any art, for any economy to grow, it needs collaboration. It requires interactions. It's exchange for growth to take place. Biodiversity is a fundamental, and for biodiversity to happen in any system of knowledge production, it requires that we see how symbiosis takes place. So to say we will have African studies in the global north, where Africa on the continent is not participant in it in an equal term, to me, I find it very problematic. So which means that we're going only to create a space where the global north or the global south, the BRICS, will be going to Africa to do African studies. It becomes extractive, where in Africa, nothing is happening. So we are not building the confidence of the younger generation to have a space where they are participating as equal. So that relationship that we are trying to avoid of travels to Africa to do African studies, where in Africa themselves nothing is taking place, becomes very problematic. And I do understand colleagues on the continent who are saying this relationship is not working. again, because it comes back to the issues of funding. So when knowledge production is commodified, yeah, so it's what Professor Harrow and Professor Joseph were talking about. Are we talking about the university in its etymological and its historical foundation, that the space where any type of knowledge with academic freedom and resources can be poured? Or are we talking about the university as now a space of commodification of knowledge, whereby then who injects in what type of science determines what goes on? So if you take an example is provided. In England, people are interested in witchcraft, they fund. So capital determines now the future of which discipline will matter, right? The humanities and social sciences in the global north are being eroded. Whereas, for instance, in Sarja at the Africa Institute, there are resources, it's open. You open African languages, you have hundreds of students enrolling in African languages. And this is the Africa Institute at Sarja in the United Arab Emirates, right? This is a bold move to say we are not in a unipolar world defined by power relationship in one directional way. Now, it's not only multipolarity, it is multiplex, where the world has to be in interaction, and Africa has to have the confidence to determine the terms of engagement. And I think if it is important for Africa, the Africans there on the continent or in the diaspora will develop partnership, because I do not believe in isolationism. Will contribute to anybody on an ethical ground who is committed to making this work for Africa on Africa's own terms. But Africa has to build its own confidence that this is necessary for Africa. It's not for other world to determine that for Africa.
Thank you. I now want to invite the members of the audience to pose their questions, make their comments. When I know the number who want to ask the questions, I will now allocate time. If you are many, then I will reduce your time. If you are not many, I will give you as much time as you want. Jacqueline Bettel from the University of Wisconsin, University of Madison, Wisconsin, or Wisconsin-Madison. Jackie, please pose your question or make your comments.
Thank you so much, Professor. I have very much enjoyed this conversation. My
Please,
question...
Can you put her on, please?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. But
okay, thank you so much, Prof.
To put you on. Is your video on?
No, but I'm still at home.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much for this enlightening conversation. My question is for Professor Richard Joseph. As someone who focuses on Cameroonian history, I could not help myself during your conversation. So my question for you is, when we think about knowledge production, if we use Cameroon as a case study, how have issues of gender, generation, and language shaped how we understand Cameroonian history today? I think about, for example, Rose Indange, who's at York, who's looking at decolonization in Cameroon through feminist lenses and opening up a whole new world on how we understand this movement. Thank you so much.
You can answer later.
Later. Go on, you can bring others on. Yes,
yeah,
I can bring
just write out the questions, Professor Shundari. Go ahead, sir.
Can you hear me?
Very well. Very well.
Okay. Yes, let me begin again by thanking you, Tony, for doing what you've done many times before. Really getting us to talk about these issues, but with a deep historical background. If I remember properly, about 4 or 5 weeks ago, we were here really absorbing the experiences of pioneers such as Beth Linfors and Ernest Emeyon, as far as the founding and the maturation and the enduring nature of the African Literature Association is concerned. My sister, Professor Alidou, has done a great job here. In fact, what you did in the first 2 minutes is very similar to what we call Ijuba in Yoruba, that is paying homage, right tribute to those who are really worth it. Professor Joseph, Professor Harrow, thank you very much. Is it a question? Just very, very briefly. I just want to say that today, when we attend the African Studies Association meeting, one we do towards the end of every year, and we see the crowd, it will appear as if many of us don't always remember that it did not start that way. I just want to historicize this a little bit. African Studies Association and its associate, African Literature Association, didn't just spring from a vacuum. They were part and parcel of Africa's struggle for liberation. In the 1970s, we are talking about, South Africa was still in the chains of the apartheid system. We were wondering whether to call what we now call Zimbabwe, whether it should be Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, or Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. Angola was not free, Mozambique was not free, and the lingering impact of racism was also everywhere. Many people still believing that it was not possible to be an African and be intelligent. And then African Studies program. I still remember somebody asking me, was it in 1976? Yeah, just tell me, what do you talk about when you go to this African Studies things? That is there anything about Africa really that you should study? Not far from there was another colleague who was a professor of literature and was wondering what Chinua Achebe really did. Was he a historian or an anthropologist? He didn't know the author of Things Fall Apart. This is what I'm saying. I believe very much that if you don't praise virtue, you are creating an avenue for vice to thrive. The two gentlemen you have brought to us today have done a lot for African studies. They were there at the beginning, as it were. Richard Joseph, as I mentioned it here before, another forum you organized. When I got back to Nigeria from Canada, that was 1979, I never met him, but I discovered everybody was talking about him. Again, that was in the 1970s. Nigeria was in the maelstrom of military dictatorship. Ideas mattered a lot, and we needed them. The social sciences faculty of the University of Ibadan was turbulent and seminar and extremely interrogative. And the ideas of Richard Joseph kept coming up. That was the time where we were talking about Udom, Peter Eke, and so on. These ideas are still very much there when we talk about the the recurrent problem of politically generated, socially generated corruption in Nigeria, in Africa, pre-Bendelism. What I'm mentioning this because it is important for us to know this. It was more or less the same with Professor Harrow and his colleagues. And here the name of my very good friend and brother, Steve Arnold, comes up very, very loudly. We joined them. We were younger colleagues, but it was they who really showed us how to do it. They were doing what they wanted to do because they were professionals, but they were doing more. African Studies Association, the ALA, African Literature Association, they were actually creating avenues that showed the world that it was possible for Black people and white people not only to work together, but to create together, to think together. And that was not good for racism. So these are some of the ideas that one has to really look at here. Very, very briefly, I'm coming to my last 100 words. Oh, yes. It is not only that now this category of Africanists are in their twilight years, but they have also done something to make sure that the places they left are not vacant. From Michigan to Rutgers, we do talk about Ken Harrow. And it is so important to mention this. When somebody sees the little thing you've written and comments on it, it touches you somewhere that we cannot really describe. So the two men you've brought have done so much for us. And it is not the books they've written, and these books are important. No, it is also the way they have validated us, fortified our faith in ourselves. We succeed from inside, we also fail from inside. It's always good to say, oh yeah, somebody there is there. I can do what he's doing, or he has a word or two to say about what I have been doing. And finally, the gate and the fence, powerful metaphors. They have remained our gates, the ones that open the door for us, instead of being the barbed fence and the wall and the gulf that separate us from the rest of the world. Finally, thank you very much for the questions you've been asking. Some of them are very wicked.
I want to ask you a question. I want to ask you a question before you go. Questions for you. So 2021, I will call it one of the best years for African literature. We cleared all the major prizes, from the Nobel to everything. So what configuration produced that, and what projection can you make? The possibility of repeating that 2021 achievement? That's one question.
2021?
Yes. Africans cleared all the major prizes that year.
Oh, what created that?
Yeah.
Well, I think that was the kind of success that could not have happened in 1 week, or that could have happened as a result of the efforts we've made in 2 years or 3 years or so. Success is accumulative, just as failures also are.
Because I think we are producing brighter works of literature.
Yeah, so, we're producing good writing, there is no doubt. Although I must tell you that I have also been very critical about the quality of some of the things that have been coming from our stable in the past 2 decades or so, particularly when you look at the state of the universities in Africa. Many of them are not as strongly staffed as they used to be in the past. And we all know that the quality of students is to a very large extent a measure of the quality of the teachers that have taught them. You know, I'm asking myself, the Josephs, the Harrows, and so on, yeah, they've gone. Have we been really able to replace them the way we would have liked? We are making progress, but I think it is possible for us better. And this is what takes me to the last thing I was going to say, actually. This is one area that has taken my concentration for some time now, and I'm working on a book on it. The present situation, we're not present, ongoing, of what we call it relocation. I call it dislocation. What is the diaspora doing to home, to native Africa? When we talk now about African literature and where it is created, where the theories are generated, where the critical practices are, where are they? There was a time these things used to happen in Africa. More and more and more now, they happen outside the continent. What is this doing to the continent itself? Like you, I'm not far from home. Virtually every young person I meet is looking for ways, is actually asking me, how can you help me? I want to get out of this system. It worries me. It makes my heart sore. How can a continent develop when the best of our brains are living and they're not looking back? When we finished our doctoral programs here in the 1960s, 1970s, the week after, we were back in Nigeria. Now, once you leave Africa, you don't return. So African studies, yes, the crowd is here now. But what about the Africa that constitutes the burden of these meetings and so on? What is home like?
Thank you. And final comment before you go, because I've known you for a long, long time. So people ask me, why are you conversant in so many disciplines, almost 11 of them? And I would tell them, when I was in school, there was a vibrant tradition of seminars. I organized some myself, so many workshops. I can go to Ibadan, finish the seminar in 7, drive to Ife. Nobody will ever do that anymore. And what was driving me is, how will I participate in the seminar on literature? I don't read literature. I will force myself to go and read them. Why will I attend a Luko Onimode seminar without no economics? I will go ahead and read them. Then from that community engagement, I began to know archaeology, anthropology, and literature, and economics. And I was wondering, is there a way to revive that kind of tradition? Because when people ask me, are you able to write on Achebe or write on values? I said, this thing did not just start today. It started from college life, and how I knew if I go to the club, I'm going to meet Dudley there. And he was a very difficult person because he would challenge you vigorously, and it would force me to go and read because I knew I'm going to see him.
I will put this down to the interpenetration of two very important forces. One is environmental, the other is personal. And I think we know that the two really operate in a kind of symbiotic way. At the time you're talking about, incidentally, I'm old enough to be a witness to the kind of activities you were talking about. You know, I often tease you. I don't think, unless you were outside the country. One way or another, in no 2 weeks passed without your making your trip between Ibadan and between Ife, where you were teaching, and Ibadan. Yes. So you were everywhere. You were observing all those experiences. That's one. But you were not the only one doing this. This is where the personal aspect also comes into consideration. But basically, our country, Nigeria, in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and up to the first half of the 1990s, was a very, very intellectual, culturally active country, although also politically chaotic. The Ife-Ibadan axis, from the Ife-Ibadan axis to then up to the north, Ahmadu Bello University, then Bayero, then Ilorin, Benin, University of Benin, and University of Nigeria, Nsukka. It was not possible to be in the country at that time, really, and not be influenced by all the things that one was seeing around. But I must say that this did not create a million geniuses. It all depends upon how the individual also absorbs this. You are a historian that is very much in the area of culture, and you come from a city of poets and satirists and musicians. We're talking about Ibadan, the home of Fuji, the home of so many other musical genres. These were things we absorbed when we were growing up, and the things that manifest in our adult years. In those days, yes, it was the forces were there that made it possible for us to have these positive achievements. This is why I'm not really satisfied, because these days these things are really not there. They are not really what they used to be. Well, to hear Richard Joseph's name, that the social sciences hall, that was lecture room, that was the largest at the University of Ibadan then. I remember one instance when there was half of the period we spent discussing political corruption in Nigeria, its inevitability, its root, the way it started. It was pre-Bendelism. In fact, there is a guy I see pre-Ben, because made it to a Yoruba thing. Many of the people didn't know who the author, who Richard Joseph was, but that idea was there. It was a period when ideas were all over the place, and people knew what it meant to be knowledgeable. Values. The oil boom did something terrible, and military dictatorship completed the wreck. And that is why values are not really the way, they are not now what they used to be. So versatility is what it is called, but versatility doesn't fall from heaven onto your laps. So it depends upon
thank you so much. Thanks you so much, the great poet. Let me call on Ambassador Lewu, who studied at the University of Ibadan. He studied agriculture long time ago and became an ambassador, and one of us. Ambassador, please.
Hello, thank you very much. Are you hearing me?
We can hear you, sir.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I would first of all like to thank you for this seminar.
Your Your system has disappointed us. Temitope
And
Fagunwa,
also for
you're back again.
especially Professor. Hello? Hello?
We're back, sir. We're listening to you, sir.
Yeah, I said I would like to appreciate Professor Alidou, the lady who spoke so well about your first question. Should we study African, should there be any African studies? And the way she analyzed the whole thing is so fantastic. I want to thank her for that. We, unfortunately, since colonialism, people have been changed from their traditional way of thinking to the European way of thinking. And the way to go back to the traditional way of thinking is to study to have studies about the African culture, the African mentality, the African creativity, and so on and so forth. So it's very important that we should have studies about Africa, particularly now that we know that the African creativity has been globalized, either in music or in dance in many parts of the world, both in Africa, in Asia, especially in the US and in Europe. That's why we have Africa in diaspora, and even the Black Americans have portrayed so much about the creativity of the African person. So having studies about Africa is very essential, so that the new generation will not be having colonial mentality in their way of life, but should always respect the dignity of the African person. As regards the area which you mentioned about slavery, which the other discussants like Professor Joseph was trying to avoid because it was too sensitive, it is true that the Arabs took a lot of African slaves from East Africa. How did they build the pyramids in Egypt and Sudan? Is it not by African slaves? We should not deny that. We should be able to come out and say it openly. We should not be shy to say the truth of what has happened. Thank God that, like Professor Alidou said regarding the GDP of Nigeria that has surpassed that of South Africa because of Nollywood. Yes, thank God she mentioned that. That's the creativity of the African person. If we have that type of service industry more and more, we shall be reckoned with in the world. We can even beat the what do you call it, the Hollywood, Hollywood of America.
Thank you, Ambassador, because thank you. I have to apologize. The ambassador lived in cosmopolitan cities, returned to his village. He and Julius Nyerere shared that humility in common. Thank you very much. On a small point of correction, we don't have the evidence that slaves built the pyramids. We're still trying to figure that out. Temitope Fagunwa, Osun State University, I think. Your question, please.
Greatest Prof.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Firstly, I want to thank Prof and also other organizers for the consistency in bringing us this kind of interesting discussion, particularly around the field of African studies. And I want to say that my own field, African history, seems to be an important component of the field of African studies. I would like to pose an important question to our lead of speakers for today. And it is to say that we have two schools of thought on the direction or what should be the nature and character of the field of African studies. You have the school of thought that think that essentially the field of African studies should be wholly the business of African scholars, that is Africans, Black Africans basically, that if the field of African studies is going to serve its actual purpose, that it must be constituted, it must be directed, it must be controlled by African scholars because clearly they understand the experiences upon which African people have gone through. And then you have this school of thought that is convinced that actually the field of African studies should be the business of everybody. It doesn't really matter where you're coming from. You're an Asian, you're Japanese, you're a European, you're a Latin American. It doesn't really matter that, African studies should be the business of everyone. And I think, you have at a point in time, Philip Cotton, who wrote a book, and a journal article, which he titled Ghettoizing African History, as a way of stressing the fact that African history stands the risk of being ghettoized if it's actually been left under the control of Africans. Philip Cotton said this.
You've made your point, and the panelists have they will respond to that. They're writing down these questions. It's on a small point of correction. Cotton is not a journal essay. It was written in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And the word will never come when one society will not study another society. As Alidou said, for a wide variety of reasons. But I will let them respond. Samson Afolabi, please introduce yourself. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please go ahead.
I'm Samson Afolabi.
Go ahead, sir. Go ahead, sir.
From Nigeria.
Go ahead.
And from a Glorious Vision University, Ogwa in Edo State.
Go ahead, sir.
And I want to thank the panel of speakers and particularly Adia Prof for this wonderful session. And my question summarily is just on the issue of indigenous knowledge, research, and documentation in Africa. Because I come to discover, not only from literature, from even my personal research work on the field, that body of knowledge in African context, in terms of in the medical area, health-related area, education, agriculture, there are body of knowledges that are purely African, purely traditional, purely local to us, that are very, very relevant. My question is just to get the thoughts of this panel of speakers and their prof on this issue of research and documentation. Doing the research, getting the empirical issues separate, but also the documentation. Because I've come to discover that some of these indigenous knowledge, they are there. The custodians, some of them are still alive, but largely undocumented. So that is just my question.
Thank you.
Take on that, sir? Yes, sir.
Yeah, your question is understood. And a small point of correction, where I don't think we've done sufficient work on that which is traditional either. Because part of what we call traditional, some of them are the consequences of the Atlantic slave trade. And when we break many of these things down, we need to do a lot of work. That work has actually not started because we need to break it down. What is it that we call this traditional? If you go to Ijebu people, they will say gari cassava is their main food. True, but that came from Brazil. Olayinka Agbetui, formerly of Indiana, is a Yoruba prince and a literature person, living in London. Agbetui, are you still living in London?
Yes, Professor Falola, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I have a few comments, and mainly one question. And the question is to Professor Harrow, and it is to deal with his approach to evaluating African literature. And he said at about, well, he and I came into African literature about the same time, even though he came at a higher level. And he was talking about people like Achebe, the grandfathers, and Okigbo. I happen to personally have a 40-year interest in Okigbo. I think, to my knowledge, I'm the only one who has fully translated Labyrinth into Yoruba up to today. I've discussed that, I think, with him on the forum. But what I want to say is, does he think that Sunday Adnosi's take on the Labyrinth did justice to that poem
Can you explain what Sunday Anose say? Can you explain that to our audience?
Well, the title of his book, is structural. Is the critical polemics. That's the title of the book. That is the structure of the poem that does justice rather than the message of in the thematic preoccupation of a work of art. And so once you explain the structure, that is where it should end. That is what many people thought he said. I actually read this. I remember very well at the University of Ibadan Library. And yes, I was a bit confused by the way he ended it. And I wanted him, because he said he used, that's why I'm calling him now, he used some of these Western theoretical backings to explain African literature because he didn't want to see them as ethnographic pieces, but as works of art. And does that work by Anose do justice? I have done it. I have translated it into Yoruba fully with critical comments. And I know that the message itself stands apart. And how does that approach actually get the reader and the student to understand it? I understand also very well, Professor Ousseina did one of his poems on how everybody among his students got frustrated by labyrinths because of the language of the author. And well, I was able to, because I sat through with great patience as a literary person, and I pieced everything together, unpacked it and repacked it. So I want him to answer that. I also want to respond to the moderator's idea of a Department of Kinship and whether we should have African Studies Association, African Studies departments in Africa. We should have African Studies department because we have European Studies department in Britain. Just because it's the whole of Europe doesn't mean it's one cultural monolith. So you have to distinguish between each of the African cultures. It's just a general name, the word Africa, which was given to area which is around Libya. That is not the whole of different African cultures. So I will just try to minimize that. And final comment is that some of the things that we speak about today has been answered by the creation of the Cultural Studies Department, intercultural linkages within the different departments. We must remember that during the classical times, what we call science today was actually called literature. Then after that, around the 19th century, early modern period, as a world historian, I know it became differentiated into various branches following the work of Isaac Newton, physics, chemistry, and biology. And then later on, biology differentiated into psychology and psychoanalysis. All of these areas I have specialized in myself. And so, yes, we can repackage disciplines, we can realign disciplines. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Prince Abetui. Mary Kinyajul, I apologize if I do not pronounce your name very well. Mary Kinyajul, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Arizona.
Arizona, that's
good. Yeah, in Phoenix.
Thank you.
I'm Kenyan, but relocated here, and I'm actually looking for a job. I must say that this discussion is timely and relevant because we are at the crossroads where the African universities used to depend a lot on foreign donor funding is drying up, and the African universities are trying to reinvent themselves. At least the African university I worked in was a research institute which was very donor dependent, and it is trying to reinvent itself. That aside, I must say that when I went to study in Cambridge University, the first thing that caught me was what I would call a discourse cultural shock, because I had read a lot about modernization, peasants, and dependency theories. And on arrival, I realized that I was actually a peasant. And I would watch people going to the coffee machine to take coffee. And I had picked coffee for a long time. And I would wonder if this coffee that kept people awake and the peasants in my country were not being paid. How can we make the economy more fair? And that I conceptualized the theme of my book, Coffee Time. So my interest in the African studies is how we can have an Africana economy perspective. And that's what I have been searching for. And I started by reading the work of Du Bois and his group economies. I read the work of Gordon Jessica, looking for cooperatives, and Hussein. And in my works, I have tried to argue for the case, if there is African dance, if there is African beats, if there is African foods, is there a way that Africans do economy? And that's what I've been trying to see in African studies here in the US. And I guess that's why my applications have not been going through, because I've been arguing that there is an African way of doing economy. And when I was offered a chance to teach at Mount Holyoke College, I realized that what is called informal economy is in Haiti, it is in Jamaica, it is in the Caribbean. And Caroline Hussein has actually shown that Roscas, the Susus, are common features of Africana economy.
Thank you very much. And some people have been saying we should not be using that label informal economy. That is actually more formal than what we call state economy. Thank you very much, and we wish you luck in finding a good job that will match your interest, your passion. The last member of the audience is Mary Owusu. Dr. Mary Owusu is currently based at Carleton via Legon, I think. I hope I'm not misrepresenting you. Thank you.
Thank you, University of Cape Coast in Ghana.
Cape Coast.
So I want to thank the speakers, and my question is short, I promise you. So what is the position of African studies in relation to Black studies? And I'm thinking here of Kenneth Harrow's thing that he mentioned about the wealth that we share. Also thinking about Professor Joseph's own of ecosystems, and Madame Alidou's own of women's studies. So you did situate yourself as someone who does women's studies. So what in your own areas within these things that you spoke about, what is the position of African studies in relation to Black studies? And then overall, in terms of knowledge production, so what is the African contribution to knowledge production? You can simplify it by just looking at political thought. That would be appreciated. African contributions to political thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Owusu. And it's an important question. And I think we will need a special panel in future to talk about African studies, Black studies, because where they combine them, Africa becomes marginal. And sometimes there's a lot of tension in that combination. Well, I will give the members of the panelists to do two things. One, respond to any question of your interest and make your closing remark so that you only speak one time. Any of you can go. Any question of your interest or any comment, respond to them and make your closing remarks.
I suppose there's one. You go ahead if you like. I think it's important to think of our disciplines as dynamic, so that the comment about Sunday and Ozier reading of Christopher Kibo's poetry was in terms of the dominant theory at the time, which was structuralism, maybe it had a unduly heavy and I think unfortunate influence. I was very glad when we got past structuralism to post-structuralism. Structuralism sort of locked us into language studies that stopped advancing things. But I want to say that things keep changing. We get trained. We get trained in disciplines. We even help participate in the creation of disciplines. But then the next step is we let go. If they don't do it our way, that's cool. That's the world. It's the way it's supposed to be. We can speak about our past with great confidence until it gets fuzzy. But let's not pretend we're prophets of the future based upon our engagements with the past. So it's changing. And sometimes the changes may be small and sometimes they're big. I'm very much taken by the change towards materiality as a center focus for theory nowadays, which means that they dropped so much of the theories I spent my life trying to understand, but that's cool. That's where it should be. And so I told you, and you keep coming back to the most central issue, which is then, if it's changing, we have to make sure that the voices that speak for, I would say, the realities of the African continent have to be heard. But they won't be heard simply because they're smart or useful or good, because they're competing in a world in which, what I said before, the production of knowledge is tied to who is paying for that production of knowledge. So that's our job. It's to say, if I can promote a voice that wouldn't otherwise be heard, or if I'll try to speak for the changes that have to be listened to, let that be my closing in a career. I don't want it. The light has to pass. It has to shine over there. And so, what we could do to pass that light on. And I guess I want to also close with complimenting Atolian Falola for his work in supporting young scholars. He does that better and more than anyone, any 100 people could do, with his conferences and with his publications and with his speaking, and even today is testimony to that. So you deserve great thanks for that. But let the change come. That's okay. It's good. It's where it should be.
Thank you, Joseph, and I wish you good health. And as you enjoy your 80s, I just pray to reach 80 like you. And if you reach 90, I will change my prayer. I want to reach 90 like Ken. Thank you. Richard,
yes.
Comments and your closing remarks. You are 80. What's your age now? 82?
No. My age is 78, so I'm still a youngster. Yes. Okay. So, no, my closing remarks is, just thinking of this particular period that we're in right now, this particular global period we're in now, and Africa in that particular period. I have been addressing that issue that, some real rethinking involving the continent must take place, and that it needs to involve not only people who define themselves in terms of African studies and Africanness and so on, but it also has to call on people from other disciplines. I'm giving a talk on my campus there, and I'll share it with you, Prof, on December 8th on reimagining Africa, and we'll be able to share that with our colleagues. So I really feel like this, and this is why your program has been so important, because you have really done what I am suggesting needs to be done, that we need to be able to bring people from a lot of different disciplines, a lot of different, even from different cultures, and let there have, much sort of richer conversations taking place. So I think we need to just continue. I think it's happening. I think in a number of sites, it's not necessarily taking place in these, I remember Tandika Makandawire some time ago saying to me, that coming to the US, for example, and always hearing about an African studies this and the other, and then getting there and realizing, well, it wasn't really a very substantial or significant entity. And sometimes it has become, you know, sort of just, like I said, enclaves within those systems. So I think this is a time in which we need to build what is currently understood as African studies, but I also think we need to widen the sphere. We need to bring more people from more disciplines into that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Alidou.
Thank you, Oga Professor Falola, for giving us the opportunity to come together to celebrate both Professor Ken Harrow and Professor Richard Joseph, and in the same process, give us an opportunity to build communities. And expand communities across the disciplines, across geographies, and to look at what are the gaps. This is a wonderful opportunity, and this is precisely why we need African studies. African studies, to me, as my seniors mentioned, it is a critical time to look at Africa in the world, Africa in relationship to herself, in its diversity and complexities, to open walls so that communities within Africa themselves get the opportunity to know one another. There are many cases where you have conflict that can be resolved through coming together, like this opportunity, where communities coexist, but they do not know each other. So African studies can be that space that allow a culture of peace and building peace, preventing conflicts, and allowing features to be examined through this complex web of ecologies. But it's also an opportunity to see ourselves not in an insular way, to be in relationship with the rest of the world. For instance, this colleague Owusu who asked, what is the relationship between Black studies and African studies? And your response really was extraordinary and very timely to explain there are opportunities, but there are a moment of tension too. And I think those moments of tensions, of where do we intersect and where do we differ, are very productive. It is very important to know that Blackness is a function of Africanity all over the world. It will be interested to look at what does it mean to be an African in India, to be an African in Hong Kong, to be an African in Korea, to be an African in China, to be an African from who is a pastoralist in an agriculturalist space, to be an African in a maritime space. What does it mean to be in those? It's important for us to look at Africa beyond the category imposed, or Blackness beyond the categories imposed on us, to see them as a productive field and a field that incorporates other identities that often are not considered when we look at Blackness and Africanity in a very essentialist and narrow way, and to create hospitality in spending in an ethical way, that generosity to be in relationship and to be in constant translation of what we mean to be African or to be Black in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As the program is ongoing, our partners always feed us with their numbers, but we will not know the full numbers until Wednesday. But we got 1.7 million people who tune on in various places to this program. and the entire conversation will be translated into Chinese and Russian languages. We already gave permission, and they are doing them very quickly. On December 3rd, we are talking about IFA because we want to bring in non-academic scholars to this program. The debate I'm having is the medium of communication. And next week, we want to decide whether the one on the far should just be Yoruba alone. And then we can do Zulu and do other languages. I know I'll be taking a risk, but maybe it's a risk worth taking so that we can incorporate people from Somalia, from Zulu, people who don't speak English, but who are tremendously respected in their communities. Thank you all. We're very grateful to our panelists for coming. I've enjoyed this conversation. We will send you the full transcript in the next 10 minutes. Thank you. And bye-bye now.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Happy Thanksgiving. Peace.